Today we are starting Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is going to be kind of long. We are going to talk about congruent triangles for the most part. We will also start one of people's favorite things about geometry, which are the proofs. If you've heard of anyone talk about those in a loving way, those are coming. Yep. Yeah.
Proofs.
Yes, proofs. They're coming, but they're not starting today. All right, into our notes. Figures are congruent if all pairs of corresponding parts are congruent, which would mean the figures have the same size and shape. We saw that a little bit when we did transformations. Most of our transformations created congruent figures. There are two types of corresponding parts: corresponding angles and corresponding sides. Now this is slightly different from corresponding angles that we looked at earlier in the year. We talked about corresponding angles when we had parallel lines. This is a slightly different type of corresponding. This time they'll be in two completely different shapes. All right, so for example 1, given that triangle JKL, so let me label this one, JKL, is congruent to triangle RST, list all the corresponding parts. So we've got to list all the corresponding angles and the corresponding sides. So how many statements do you think we're making? How many different pairs of things could we find? How many pairs of angles do you think we would have? 3 pairs of angles. What about pairs of sides? 3. So altogether we're going to be making 6 statements. Now we just talked about how in congruent figures, corresponding parts are congruent to each other. So when we start this, we could talk about angle J, just pick an angle, is going to correspond to or be congruent to what angle from the other triangle? Angle R. Okay, now, not only does it appear that way, but we know that from the way they listed their congruent statements. So congruent statements have to be listed in a specific way, meaning if they list angle J first, then the angle that corresponds to it has to also be listed first. Okay, so J corresponds to R. What about angle K? Good, it would be congruent to or correspond to angle S. And last but not least, we have angle L. Good, corresponds or is congruent to angle T. The same kind of thing holds true for the sides. So if I start with side JK, that was the first 2 letters. So when I go to my other triangle, I would be using what side? RS. Good. So side RS. Then we move on. We could talk about side KL. It would be congruent to ST. Lastly, we would have what side? Good. JL congruent to TR or RT. Remember that you can list sides with 2 letters forwards or backwards. Another thing we could do is go through and mark our diagrams with arcs and tick marks. So like J and R both get 1 arc. K and S get 2. L and T would get 3. Same kind of thing could be done for the sides. JK and RS get 1. KL and ST get 2. TR and JL get 3. Okay, so sometimes you will see the diagrams marked already. Sometimes you'll be given a congruent statement like you were here. You just have to know how to use the information you were given. All right, somebody give me a pair of congruent angles. P and E, good. Angle P would be corresponding congruent to angle E. I'll mark those. Somebody else give me another one. That didn't sound like someone else, but that is true. M and D are congruent. They're both listed in the middle. M and D. 2 arc marks for those. All right, a third pair. N and C. They can each get 3 marks. Okay, so remember, angles are pretty easy as long as you can list them with just one letter. Sometimes we'll have triangles that overlap each other and then you have to use 3 letters to name it. Right, so instead of calling it angle P, we'd have to call it NPM. But for now, 1-letter angles are easy. We just match them up. Sides should also be pretty easy. Who can give me a pair of corresponding sides? PM and ED. So both of those letters came first. PM, first 2 letters. ED, first 2 letters. PM, ED. Okay, another one. Good. MN and DC. Or CD, whichever you prefer. We can mark those congruent. And my last pair of sides. Good. PN and EC. 1, 2, 3 tick marks for those. Questions, concerns on example 2? Okay, so even without the picture, if you just have the statement given to you, you should be able to fill all of this in. We ready to move on? Okay. All right, the 2 triangles shown are congruent. Let me label them for you. We'll call it A, B, C. And D, E, F. Okay, so this time we are given just 2 triangles. We are told that they are congruent. We are asked to identify all the corresponding parts. So if we know that they are congruent, we could go through and kind of mark them congruent right now. If you want to do that, you can. Or if you want to just start making your statements, that's fine with me too. Okay, I'll go ahead and mark them up if we know that they are congruent. So this time, give me a pair of corresponding or congruent angles. Good. Angle A and angle D. Another pair. Good. B and E. Another pair. There's only 1 pair left. C and F. Okay, but that's just the angles. If they want all corresponding parts, I'm not just interested in angles. I also need what else? Sides. So I should have 3 statements for sides. What's one of them? We said AC and DF would be congruent. What's another pair? Good. BA or AB and ED or DE. Remember, you can list them forwards or backwards. I don't really care. What about my last pair of congruent sides? BC and EF. Good. Questions, concerns about that? Okay, part B asks us to write a congruence statement. When it says a congruence statement, it means about the entire figures, not just about a little piece of it. So on examples 1 and 2, you were given the congruent statements. Now this time we have to come up with it. So we're going to be talking about the whole triangles. Remember, when they gave us a congruent statement, they gave it to us so that corresponding parts matched up with each other. So when we write them, the first triangle that you write, technically you can list it in any order that you want. So what do you want to name your first triangle? ABC works for me. Keep it easy. Now, if we name the first one triangle ABC, when we name the second one, we better make sure that the angle that's congruent to angle A is in the first position. The side that's congruent to AB is in the first 2 positions. You've got to match it up piece by piece. So what would the only option for our second triangle be? DEF. Okay, now this one kept it pretty easy, all in alphabetical order. That does not always happen. It's nice when it does. Do we understand why we have to be specific when we write our congruent statement? Nobody understands. Okay, well, hopefully you do, because if you have to write a congruent statement, let's say on a homework check or something, you better make sure it's in the right order, otherwise it is not correct. All right, another one for you to try on your own. These triangles are not oriented the same direction. Let's see. Okay, so let's give it a try with these ones. Now, you could go through and at least mark your angles. That might help if they're telling us that they're congruent. If I'm giving angle C 1 arc mark, which other angle do you think deserves 1 arc? M. Okay, what about if I give T 2, what other angle deserves 2? I don't think it's O. That would leave us with P getting 2, and that would leave O and A getting 3 of them. Okay, they just flipped it around a little bit, turned it. Now, if I give side CA 1 tick mark, which other side do you think deserves 1 tick mark? CA. OM. So the CA is between 1 and 3 arcs. Do we see that? 1 arc, 3 arcs. So M and O would be my 1 arc, 3 arc side. Does that make sense? Sides are a little bit trickier when they're not oriented the same way. So then if I give side AT 2 tick marks, which other side deserves 2? OP. That one's a little bit easier since it is definitely the shortest one. And then that leaves CT and MP to both get 3. Now, as we've gone through this, we've technically identified all of our corresponding parts, but I want you to make the statements and then also make your congruence statement. So if you haven't done those yet, start writing those now, and we'll talk about them in just a moment. Remember to put your angle symbol by angles and your bars over the sides. If you don't have those things, technically it's not completely correct. All right, somebody give me a pair of congruent angles. A and O. Sure. Angle A. Congruent to angle O. Another pair. C and what? Okay. Crescencio, did you have the last pair? T and P. Wonderful. All right, what about sides? AC and MO. Okay, another pair. CT and MP. Last pair. AT and OP. Good. All right, what about our congruence statement? So remember, that's when we talk about the whole entire triangles. So we put a little triangle symbol. What did we name our first triangle? CAT. And if we name our first one CAT, how do we have to name the second one? MOP. Okay, now you didn't have to name the first one CAT. If you had named it, for example, triangle TCA, then you just would have had to name your second one PMO. So you have options. There is another way of naming them as well, but you just have to make sure that your corresponding pieces are matching up, meaning C and M match up, A and O match up, T and P match up. Questions, concerns? Ready for our last one? Yes, no, maybe so? Kind of, sort of? Think about it. Okay, they tell us that triangle SUT is congruent to triangle WXY. Now, in order to do these questions, I need to give you a little more information about these. So, I'm going to tell you the side lengths for the first triangle. Oh, let's go with 8, 10, and 14 for those side lengths. And let's label some of these angles. I'll just label these two angles. Okay, so imagine that that was all given to you from the beginning. I basically just made it up, but imagine that that information was provided to you. Okay, if we are asked to find the length of segment WY, well, I didn't label any of the segments in that whole triangle. But if I know these triangles are congruent, then WY should be congruent to which other side? ST. So if you want to show kind of the reasoning through this, ST is congruent to WY. ST first and last letter, WY first and last letter. So, knowing that, then the length of WY better be 14, because that was the length of ST. Questions about how we thought through that one? Okay, letter B asks us to find the measure of angle S. Well, angle S better be congruent to which other angle? Right?
Oh, wait, no.
W, good. So first letter, first letter. Do we know angle W?
Yes. 25.
Wow. Why is it not just 25?
You gotta add it up to 180.
Good. The angles inside of a triangle better add up to 180. And if I were to label W as 25, these would not add up to 180. Okay, so I need to find W so that I know what S is. So somebody already said it, but how we would do that is to take 180 minus 100 minus 25, and we would get 55 degrees. So that is what belongs at angle W, and therefore is also the measure of angle S. So sometimes you kind of have to think it through a little bit further. It's not always going to just be given to you immediately. Questions, concerns? Warm, fuzzy feelings? Cold pricklies? Okay.